Hello Kadivas, and welcome back to another tutorial. This is going to be a detailed cutting and sewing tutorial for this wrap blouse. The really cool thing about this design is the sleeve and the bodice are one piece, so you don't need to make a separate sleeve pattern. In fact, this entire tutorial does not involve any pattern making. We're going to be cutting straight onto fabric, and the sleeve design is like this butterfly circular shape. It wraps and ties around on the front, and I also decided to add this really cool ruffle detail around the neckline. So if you'd like to see how I made this piece, make sure to keep on watching. This tutorial is a request from one of you guys from the previous one I did, and it was a request to make a wrap blouse where the sleeve was integrated. So I went ahead to do my research because I had never tried out that design before. I searched on Google to see what other designers had done, studied a few tutorials just to get a gist of how you would cut the front, the back and the sleeve as one piece. And there were actually a lot of tutorials already existing on YouTube. I'm going to link some of my favorites in the video description down below because people have found a way to really play around with the design, but I am bringing my own flavor to this style. So I'm going to be cutting straight onto fabric, and the two major measurements that I'm going to be using is deciding on my waistline as well as the length of the top. You only need 1.5 meters for this style, and I'm going to be using Ankara for the outside, and then I found this plain red cotton that I'm going to be using as my lining. I ended up using 1.5 as well, and then I used 2 buttons to fasten the inside of my wrap blouse, as well as an elastic thread. Rather than have a tie detail inside, I'm going to be using this elastic thread and button method. Now that I have my materials out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and start cutting. My fabric here I have already folded like so. It is 1.5 meters, and the bottom edge is folded, and the total length of this entire piece is my desired blouse length times 2. Coming up to the top edge, I'm going to be marking from this corner 1/4 of my waist measurement plus 5.5 inches, and my total was 12. So that I'm just marking with a fabric chalk, and then I'm marking 6 inches above like so. Those 2 points I'm going to connect together using my pattern master and my chalk. This is the kind of chalk that I can easily rub off with a damp cloth, so I don't have to worry about the possibility of this not leaving when I'm done sewing this piece. I'm going to slide the fabric to the other side, to the right side like so, and then I'm going to come to this edge and mark 1/4 of my waist measurement plus 1 inch horizontally, and like I did for the other side, mark 6 inches above that and then connect both points together. This is going to become your side seam area, but to make more sense when I draw more lines. So I'm connecting those 2 points together like I did for the previous section that I just showed you guys, and once I have that there, I'm actually going to be marking 5 centimeters or 2 inches away from the top of that line that I just showed you guys. So you have an angle that looks like this, and then I'm going to be drawing a slanted line that connects that 2-inch mark to the bottom edge of the fabric. Now that I have these dimensions drawn here, I'm going to be squaring them across to the edge of my fabric or to the selvage of my fabric. If you want your sleeve to be even longer, you would need to use a wider fabric, but the width of my fabric was about 50 centimeters. So at this point I am finding the middle point of my fabric, and once I have that middle point marked, I'm going to be drawing in the shape of the sleeve. You can have the sleeve as like, you know, the kimono style sleeve, but I wanted it to be more rounded, so I'm going to be drawing a curve that goes from that middle point into the bottom or the top edge of the side seam or the corners of the side seam, so I have a shape that looks like this. Now once I have that drawn in place, I'm going to be cutting out the excess fabric. The dimensions I have marked already have seam allowance included, which is why I added like an extra inch on one side and an extra 5.5 on the other side. One side is going to be the front and the other side is going to be the back. I'm going to fold this piece yet again to find the middle point along the folded edge, which is where my necklines are going to sit. And this I'm just marking with a chalk. Once I have that marked, I'm going to open up my fabric again, and I'm going to be marking 10 centimeters or 4 inches along that midpoint mark. Once I have that marked in place, towards the right hand side, I'm going to be marking 1.5 inches, which is going to become the depth of my back neckline that I'm going to connect back to the 4-inch mark. So we have, you know, your typical looking back neckline that is a lot shallower compared to the front, sitting on this side. And then the front neckline is a V, so I'm essentially just going to draw a V shape or a slanted line that connects the bottom edge from the left side to our 4-inch point, or where the neckline is. So we have the front and the back neckline already drawn in place and ready to be cut out. I'm going to be cutting along the chalk line I just did, which I've highlighted with the white line earlier on. And once I have that cut out, I essentially have the entire neckline for the front and the back of my piece in place and already ready to go. So this is what the piece looks like, and this is my lining. I just thought it would be more visible to do this on the lining since it's plain red fabric, but I'm essentially going to use the same piece to cut my main material, which is Ankara, that has a lot of beautiful colors and prints. So this I'm going to layer in such a way that the back edge, which is the edge to the right, is cut on a fold, and then the side with the V neckline is the front. That one I will cut as 2 separate pieces, but because everything is connected, this is the entire top. We don't need to make any separate sleeve, we don't need to make any separate collar piece, we don't need to make any separate bodice. It is cut as one piece, which is why I think this design is very, very clever. Once you get a hang of how it's cut, you can customize the length of the bodice, the length of the sleeve, how deep you want your neckline to be on the front or in the back to your liking. Once I had the main piece and the lining cut, I knew I had the main pieces out of the way. The next thing I need to do is add the ruffle detail, and for that I am measuring around the front and the back neckline, and I just took note of that measurement. I'm going to need to create a ruffle piece that measures that combined measurement of the front and the back neckline times 4, because I want the ruffle to be really full and gathered properly around the neck, and the width of my ruffle piece is 4 inches. This detail is optional. I don't know why I just thought about adding a ruffle around the neckline. It kind of gives it a very romantic feel, but if you don't want that, you can skip this detail. But I essentially just went ahead to cut a piece that was 89 by 4 inches long, and I cut a pair of that, as well as cutting the waistband piece. The waistband piece, the length is essentially your waistline, and then the width of it is 4 inches. And for the belt, I've cut a pair of the belt pieces. They are 4 inches wide, but then they are 20 inches long, so there's enough to actually tie on the side of the top. So those are all of the pieces needed to put this piece together. It is time to actually get into sewing. Cutting this blouse took less than 2 hours because of the fact that you don't need to make a sewing pattern, and I'm going to jump straight into assembling everything together. The first thing I'm going to do is work on the ruffle piece. So I'm just putting right sides together of that really long piece, and I'm going to be sewing them up. That seam is going to sit on my center back, and I'm just stitching it up with a normal straight stitch on a 1 centimeter seam allowance. After doing that, I'm going to take this piece to my iron and fold it in half, putting the wrong sides inside, and just press it like so. Once I have the entire thing pressed, I would have the folded edge on the outer side, which is what will be visible, and the raw edge will sit into the neckline seam. So before I stitch that up, I'm finishing up the sides, and to do this I am folding with right sides facing each other along the ends, and I'm going to be sewing on a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Once I'm done stitching that, I will trim down the corners and then push the right side through, so I have a nicely beautifully finished corner on both sides of my ruffle, and I don't have to think about finishing these ends once I have stitched it into the neckline of my blouse. To create the gathered ruffle detail along this piece on the raw open edge, I'm just sewing with the loosest stitch on my machine, and after sewing that, I'm going to take my time pulling the thread. I honestly don't know why I don't have a gathering foot yet, because that would save me from doing this, but this is like how I would create gathers. It takes a lot of time because you have to push and evenly distribute the gathers along the piece, and this is what it looks like after pulling all of the threads and creating the gathers to my liking. Now I'm going to open up my main piece, which is this Ankara side, and I'm going to be placing the ruffle piece along the neckline, and I'm putting this on the right side of my fabric. I'm just going to pin down places and points, so once the pin has everything held down and it's time to sew, I know I have distributed the gathers in a way that I am happy with. Like, isn't this cute? I really like this detail around the neckline. Like, comment down below if you love this detail as well. Now, to finish up the neckline of the top, I'm going to be placing the lining facing the right side of my main piece, and I'm going to be sewing with one stitch, sandwiching the ruffle detail around the neckline, and then to finish the sleeve, I'm going to be sewing along this bottom curved edge of the sleeve, so we have a clean, beautiful finish on that side as well. When it comes to sewing the ruffle detail into the neckline, because of how tight the gathers are, I found that I had to keep checking that the seam allowance on all three layers, so like the Ankara layer, the ruffle layer, and then the lining, they were evenly distributed, or like in such a way that I was happy with. But once I was done stitching the neckline, I'm just going in here to cut tiny incisions to ensure that when I turn this thing inside out, it lays as flat as possible before turning the blouse inside out. And with the lining already stitched in there, I'm going to be tucking away the seam around the neckline, the seam around the sleeve, and I have a very clean finish on the inside of the blouse. This I'm going to take to my iron to just press everything down to relax the stitching, and this is what it looks like so far. The shape is really cool, it's really beautiful. And to finish up the sides, I'm going to be joining the sides in such a way that I am going to pick the print sides and then put them together with right sides facing each other, and then I'm going to be sewing the lining together. So it's a case of I start from one end, I stitch up to under the sleeve, and then I sew down the other end. So when both sides are stitched and then the raw edges or the seams put against each other on the inside, you won't see any roughness or any untidy seams when you open up the blouse as you wear it. So I'm just adding some pins here to keep things in place. I'm going to pin the left side and the right side, and then with one continuous stitch I'm going to be joining the side seam of the blouse. You can start from the lining layer or the print layer, whichever side you want to work on. Basically, when you just get to the middle point or directly underneath the sleeve, you would want to leave your needle in and then turn your piece around, drop the footer again, and then continue stitching until you get to the end. After doing this for one side, I repeated it on the other side, and if you've done this correctly, you will have a little bit of excess on this back edge. This I'm going to be trimming in such a way that I create a curved seam or curved hem on the back hemline, and I'm going to just trim away that excess on both sides before thinking about adding my waistband. Now, to ensure that that seam under the sleeve is a lot more relaxed, I'm just cutting tiny incisions into the seam allowance right at the corner where I turned, because that would allow the fabric to just spread out more evenly and prevent it from looking super tight, super bulky, or having unnecessary gathers there. The next step I'm going to work on is adding the waistband to the waistline of the blouse, which is how I'm going to finish the waistline, as well as adding the belt that would allow me to fasten this piece around my waistline. The long waistband piece, I'm going to be folding in half like so and ironing. You can iron interfacing if your fabric is not very stiff or if you want to just give it more structure, but I basically just folded mine in half. And then I also folded in the edges by 1 centimeters ready to stitch, and I've grabbed one piece of my belt, and this I'm going to be joining along one edge. The belt piece I folded and ironed in half as well, just like how I did with the waistband, and I'm going to be sewing them up on a 1 centimeter seam allowance with right sides facing each other. After doing that, I'm going to go to one of the ends, and like how I finished the edges of the ruffle, I'm going to put right sides facing each other and then sew on the wrong side, so that helps me finish the very end of this side of the waistband. I'm just trimming down the corners before turning this side inside out. On the other side of this joined waistband piece, I'm going to be adding the elastic threads, and this I have cut as 2-inch straps. I'm going to be adding 2 of this, so they loop over my buttons, because I'm going to be adding 2 buttons to finish up this blouse on the inside, rather than have like a thin strap situation like I had on my wrap skirt, which I did like 2 or 3 tutorials before this. And once I trim down the corners and turn it inside out, this is what the ends of my waistband looks like. Now I'm going to grab my blouse and I'm going to be joining it in 2 steps. I like to do this method because it just ensures for a much cleaner finish. And I'm going to be joining on this side towards the lining first. I'm going to pin this just so nothing moves and goes crazy, and because I've already folded the edge where I'm going to be stitching the waistband onto the hemline of my blouse, I know how far in I need to stitch. Once all that area was pinned, I'm going to be sewing it on a 1 centimeter seam allowance from one end to the other, and this I'm doing it in such a way that I try to maintain the same amount of seam allowance from the beginning all the way till the end. And after stitching it like so, I would go back in and use the other side of the waistband to now finish the waistline. So I'm starting from this end, or this extension belt area that I stitched onto my waistband, and I'm just sewing the open or bottom edge close. And when I reach the side where the waistline of the top or the blouse sits, I'm going to fold over the other side, which I've already pressed by 1 centimeter, so I do not think about if I'm folding it by the same amount. And I'm going to stitch it to conceal the seam on the right side of my blouse. The second to last step is to work on the other belt. This I'm folding with right sides facing each other, and I'm going to be sewing the open end close so I create an actual belt that I can tie up with the other side to create the wrap detail that this blouse has. After sewing up the sides, I'm going to turn this piece inside out after trimming down the corners, so I have a clean, beautiful finish along the edges once I've turned this inside out. But this took some time because the belt is on the slimmer side, so I just did this with hand, ironed it nice and flat before going to the open end that allowed me to turn it inside out. And I'm going to tuck it in by about 1 centimeter and just top stitch that edge close. Once I was done doing that, I knew this belt was ready to be attached to the waistline of my blouse after stitching it around, so I have a really nice detail around the edges of the belt. So this is what the other side of the belt looks like. I'm going to grab my blouse and I'm going to fold this in such a way that I want the overlap to be, so I know exactly where to put this belt that is going to be tied with the one that is extended from the waistband. So once I had an idea of where I wanted that to sit along the side, I'm just going to pin it down in place. And after pinning that on the waistline of my blouse, I'm going to take it to my machine and I'm essentially just going to stitch the belt into that section of the waistband of the blouse. The final step is to add the buttons that sit on the inside of this blouse. They sit on this section like so. This you would estimate by folding your overlap over, and you can mark with a chalk exactly where you want your buttons to be. I opted for 2 buttons because of the width of my waistband, and once I had marked down where I wanted my buttons to be, I'm just going in to hand sew the buttons in such a way that the thread is not visible on the right side of the fabric and the buttons are securely on the inside. So once they are stitched in place, the buttons would loop over the elastic thread, and because the thread is elastic, it would make for a comfortable wearing experience when I have this piece on. So that's the final step of making this wrap blouse. It didn't take long, if I'm being entirely honest. I would say it took about a day, even though I did it over 2 days because I was doing other projects as well. But it took about a day or half a day if you're really quick with like cutting and sewing. You could also skip the ruffle detail if you don't want to. If you could also skip the lining part if you don't want to, but this is how it turned out. This is one of those tops I know when I have it on, people are going to be asking, where is your top from? It's really cool, it's really pretty, and I love how it turned out. The back is just simple and straight, and the fit is more on the relaxed side. If you want it super tight on your body, you would have to ensure that the waistline that you work with is really snug, but I added ease on mine and it just came out really cool on. If you guys enjoyed this tutorial, please give this video a thumbs up. Leave any more requests for future tutorials in the comment section down below, and if you create this, don't forget to tag me on social media at Kim Dave Designs. And until next time, have a good morning, afternoon and evening wherever you are. Bye.